Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall or talking about boys, she could be found at the local shooting range with her grandfather, a retired Army sergeant. Her hands, though small and delicate, held firearms with the steady precision of someone born for it. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday at Fort Campbell. Sarah, now 22 and fresh out of basic training, stood in line with dozens of other recruits waiting for weapon assignments. The drill sergeant's voice echoed across the courtyard as he called out names and handed out standard-issue M16 rifles. When Sarah's turn came, she stepped forward with confidence that surprised even herself. The drill sergeant, a burly man named Thompson with scars mapping stories across his weathered face, looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. At barely 5 feet 4 inches and weighing less than most of the equipment the male soldiers carried, Sarah knew what everyone was thinking. "Martinez, Sarah," Thompson barked, reading from his clipboard. "Standard M16 for you, soldier." Sarah's heart pounded as she made a decision that would change her life forever. Instead of accepting the weapon and falling back in line like every other recruit, she remained standing at attention. "Sir, I request permission to speak," she said, her voice clear despite the nervous energy coursing through her veins. Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. "Make it quick, Martinez." "Sir, I formally request assignment of a sniper rifle instead of the standard-issue weapon." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before a king. A ripple of laughter spread through the ranks behind her. Some recruits snickered openly while others shook their heads in disbelief. Even Thompson's stern expression cracked into what might have been amusement. "A sniper rifle?" Thompson repeated slowly, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Martinez, do you understand what you're asking for? Snipers are selected after extensive training and evaluation. They're typically our strongest, most experienced soldiers." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "Sir, I understand the requirements. I've been shooting competitively since I was 12. I can outshoot most of the men in this unit." The laughter grew louder now. Someone behind her muttered something about little girls playing soldier while another voice called out, maybe she should start with a water gun first. Thompson held up his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Martinez, I admire your confidence, but confidence doesn't make a sniper. These weapons require strength, endurance, and mental toughness that, frankly, most people don't possess." "With respect, sir, I possess all of those qualities," Sarah replied. She could feel the weight of every stare in the courtyard, but something inside her refused to back down. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind from countless hours at the range. "Never let anyone tell you what you can't do based on what you look like." Thompson studied her for a long moment. Around them, the other recruits had gone quiet, sensing that something significant was happening. Even the other drill sergeants had stopped their activities to watch the exchange. "Martinez," Thompson said finally, "snipers go through months of specialized training. They carry equipment weighing more than half your body weight across terrain that would break grown men. They spend days motionless in hostile conditions, waiting for the perfect shot. They make life and death decisions that affect entire missions." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the opportunity to prove I can meet those standards." The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Thompson's expression had shifted from amusement to something harder to read. He glanced around at the watching crowd, then back at Sarah. "Martinez, I'm going to give you a piece of advice," he said, his voice lower now, meant just for her. "The military isn't a place for dreams and fantasies. It's a place for realistic assessment of abilities and limitations. I suggest you focus on mastering the basics before you start reaching for specialized roles." He turned to grab an M16 from the weapons rack, clearly intending to end the conversation. But Sarah remained at attention, unmoving. "Sir, I'm not leaving without that opportunity," she said quietly. But every person in the courtyard heard her. Thompson froze, the rifle halfway extended toward her. "Excuse me?" I said, "I'm not leaving without the opportunity to prove myself, sir. If you won't give me a chance based on my record and qualifications, then tell me what I need to do to earn that chance." The drill sergeant's face darkened. This was insubordination, plain and simple. Around them, the other recruits shifted nervously, sensing that Sarah had just crossed a line that could end her military career before it started. "Martinez, Thompson," said slowly, "you're walking a very dangerous line right now." But before he could continue, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "What seems to be the problem here, Sergeant Thompson?" Every head in the courtyard turned toward the source of the voice. General Patricia Morrison strode across the training ground with the kind of presence that made seasoned soldiers straighten their spines automatically. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform was pristine despite having just stepped off a helicopter that still sat on the landing pad, rotors slowly winding down. General Morrison wasn't supposed to be at Fort Campbell that day. She was the commanding officer of Special Operations Command, a woman who had clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated field through sheer brilliance and uncompromising standards. Her unexpected appearance sent a ripple of nervous energy through everyone present. Thompson snapped to attention so quickly he nearly dropped the M16 he was still holding. "General Morrison, ma'am. Just conducting standard weapon assignments for new recruits." The general's sharp blue eyes swept across the assembled soldiers, before settling on Sarah, who remained standing at attention in front of the weapons table. Morrison had been briefing with base commanders when she heard raised voices from the training area. Something about the commotion had drawn her attention enough to investigate personally. "I see," Morrison said calmly. "And what was this recruit requesting that seemed to cause such a stir?" Thompson's jaw worked silently for a moment. He was caught between his instinct to protect his authority and his obligation to answer a direct question from a general. The recruit was requesting assignment of a sniper rifle instead of standard equipment, ma'am. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. She walked closer to Sarah, her boots clicking against the concrete with military precision. "Is that so? And what's your name, soldier?" "Private Sarah Martinez, ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Being this close to a general was intimidating enough without the weight of the entire situation pressing down on her shoulders. "Martinez," Morrison repeated thoughtfully. "Tell me, Private Martinez, what makes you think you're qualified for sniper training?" Sarah felt every eye in the courtyard boring into her. This was her moment, possibly her only chance to make her case to someone who might actually listen. She thought of her grandfather, of all the hours they'd spent perfecting her technique, of the state championships she'd won, of the dreams that had carried her through basic training. "Ma'am, I've been shooting competitively for 10 years. I hold state records in precision rifle competitions. I can consistently hit targets at 800 meters with iron sights. I scored expert marksman on every weapons qualification in basic training, often outscoring my male counterparts." Morrison nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Impressive credentials, but surely Sergeant Thompson here has explained to you the physical demands of sniper operations." "He has, ma'am, and I understand those demands. I've trained extensively in wilderness survival and endurance. I completed basic training in the top 10% of my class, including all physical fitness requirements." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several recruits were genuinely surprised to hear about Sarah's accomplishments. In the competitive atmosphere of basic training, individual achievements often went unnoticed unless someone made a point of bragging about them, which Sarah never did. Morrison turned to Thompson. "Sergeant, what exactly were your objections to this request?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably. With the general asking direct questions, his earlier dismissive attitude seemed harder to justify. "Ma'am, sniper training is extremely selective. We typically require candidates to have field experience and demonstrated excellence in standard infantry operations before consideration." "I see. And how do we typically identify soldiers with the potential for specialized training?" "Through observed performance and recommendation from commanding officers, ma'am." "And has Private Martinez had the opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities under field conditions?" Thompson hesitated. "No, ma'am. She's just completed basic training." Morrison's slight smile was barely visible, but it sent a clear message to everyone watching. "So we're making determinations about her capabilities without actually testing them?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Thompson realized he was being backed into a corner by someone far more experienced in military politics than he was. But before he could formulate a response, Morrison turned back to Sarah. "Private Martinez, you're asking for an opportunity that most soldiers don't receive until much later in their careers, if at all. The failure rate for sniper training is over 70%. Even if you were accepted, there's no guarantee you'd succeed." Sarah met the general's gaze directly. "Ma'am, I understand the risks and the statistics, but I also know that if I'm not given the chance to try, I'll definitely fail. I've spent my entire life preparing for this opportunity, even before I knew it existed." Morrison studied Sarah's face carefully, as if looking for something specific. The general had seen thousands of young soldiers over her career, all convinced they were destined for greatness. Most were wrong, but occasionally, very rarely, she encountered someone with that indefinable quality that separated the exceptional from the merely ambitious. "Tell me about your grandfather," Morrison said suddenly. Sarah blinked in surprise. "Ma'am? You mentioned competitive shooting since age 12. Someone taught you. Who was it?" "My grandfather, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, retired Army. He served 3 tours in Vietnam as a designated marksman." Morrison's expression shifted subtly. "Rodriguez? I knew a Master Sergeant Rodriguez in the 75th Rangers. Manuel Rodriguez?" "Yes, ma'am. That's him." For the first time since arriving, Morrison smiled genuinely. "Manny Rodriguez was one of the finest shots I ever encountered. He saved my platoon's bacon more than once during my early days as a lieutenant." The revelation sent a shock through Sarah. Her grandfather had mentioned serving with a young officer named Morrison, but she'd never made the connection. The military was full of people with the same last names. Morrison turned back to Thompson. "Sergeant, I'm going to ask you to make an exception to standard protocol." Thompson's face went pale. "Ma'am? I want Private Martinez given a field evaluation. If she can demonstrate the shooting skills she claims to possess, I want her file sent to Special Operations Command for review." "Ma'am, that's highly irregular." Morrison's voice cut through his protest like ice. "Sergeant Thompson, are you questioning my direct order?" Thompson's face flushed red as he realized the corner he'd been backed into. "No, ma'am. I'll arrange the evaluation immediately." "Good," Morrison replied crisply. "I want it conducted this afternoon. I'll observe personally." As the general walked away, the crowd of recruits slowly dispersed, but Sarah could feel their stares following her. Some looked impressed, others skeptical, and a few seemed downright hostile. She'd just been handed an unprecedented opportunity, but she also knew she'd painted a massive target on her back. Thompson approached her with an expression that mixed resignation with barely concealed irritation. "Martinez, you better hope you can back up all that talk. The general doesn't like having her time wasted, and if you embarrass me in front of her, you'll spend the rest of your service scrubbing latrines." 3 hours later, Sarah found herself on the base's most challenging rifle range. Word had spread through Fort Campbell like wildfire, and despite Thompson's attempts to keep the evaluation quiet, dozens of off-duty soldiers had gathered to watch. Some came out of curiosity, others hoping to see the cocky new recruit taken down a peg. The rangemaster, a grizzled veteran named Cole, had set up a series of targets at increasingly difficult distances. Starting at 200 meters and extending out to nearly a kilometer, each target was smaller than the last. The final target, barely visible to the naked eye at 900 meters, was a playing card pinned to a post. General Morrison arrived precisely at 1400 hours, accompanied by Colonel Jenkins, the base's head of training operations, and Master Sergeant Rodriguez himself. Sarah's grandfather had driven 4 hours from his ranch when Morrison's aide called to tell him about the situation. "Mijo," he whispered to Sarah as she prepared her equipment, using the Spanish endearment he'd called her since childhood. "Remember what I taught you. The rifle is just a tool. The real weapon is your mind." Sarah nodded, trying to calm her racing pulse. She'd brought her own rifle, the custom precision weapon her grandfather had helped her build over years of competitions. Thompson had initially objected, but Morrison overruled him, pointing out that snipers often used specialized equipment. "Private Martinez," Morrison called out. "You'll have one shot at each target starting with the closest. Any questions?" "No, ma'am," Sarah replied, settling into position behind her rifle. The first 3 targets at 200, 300, and 400 meters fell easily. Sarah's breathing was controlled, her movements fluid and confident. Each shot found its mark dead center, drawing murmurs of approval from the watching crowd. At 500 meters, the target was a 6-inch circle painted on a steel plate. Sarah adjusted her scope, compensated for the afternoon wind that had picked up, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth pressure her grandfather had drilled into her since she was 12 years old. The distinctive ping of bullet meeting steel rang across the range. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were completely silent, watching something none of them had expected to see. Even Thompson's expression had shifted from skepticism to genuine surprise. At 600 meters, the target was a 4-inch square. Sarah spent longer preparing for this shot, feeling the wind patterns, checking the light conditions. When she fired, the spotter confirmed another perfect hit. 700 meters, 800 meters. Each shot found its target with mechanical precision. Sarah was in what athletes call the zone, a state of perfect focus where everything else faded away except her, the rifle, and the distant target. At 850 meters, Rangemaster Cole called out, "Ma'am, this is further than most of our qualified snipers can consistently hit. The playing card target at 900 is considered an expert-level challenge." Morrison nodded. "Continue." Sarah approached the final shooting position. The playing card, an ace of spades, fluttered slightly in the distance. At 900 meters, it was barely a speck against the backstop. She'd made shots at this distance before, but never with this many people watching. Never with so much riding on the outcome. She settled behind her rifle and began her preparation routine. Breathing deep and slow, she felt her heart rate begin to settle. Through her scope, the playing card came into sharp focus. She could see it moving slightly in the wind, a gentle dance that she needed to time perfectly. The seconds stretched into minutes as Sarah waited for the perfect moment. The watching crowd had grown to over 100 soldiers, all holding their breath along with her. Even General Morrison found herself leaning forward slightly, invested in the outcome despite her professional demeanor. Sarah felt the wind die down to almost nothing. The card steadied. Her breathing stopped at the natural pause between exhale and inhale. Her finger applied pressure to the trigger with the same gentle force her grandfather had taught her to use when handling something precious and fragile. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The report echoed across the range and into the surrounding hills. For a moment that seemed to last forever, everyone strained to see the result. Rangemaster Cole had his binoculars trained on the target. "Target is..." He paused, adjusting his focus. "Target is hit. Dead center." The explosion of cheers and applause from the crowd was unlike anything typically heard on a military rifle range. Soldiers who had been skeptical an hour earlier were now pounding Sarah on the back and congratulating her on a shot many of them couldn't have made. Morrison walked over to where Sarah was carefully securing her rifle. The general's expression was thoughtful, almost calculating. "Impressive shooting, Private Martinez. Your grandfather taught you well." "Thank you, ma'am." Morrison glanced around at the celebrating crowd, then back at Sarah. "However, marksmanship is only one component of what we do. Are you prepared for what comes next?" Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Morrison turned and walked toward a black SUV that had just arrived at the range. 2 men in civilian clothes got out, but their bearing and alertness marked them clearly as military or intelligence personnel. Morrison spoke quietly with them for several minutes, occasionally glancing back toward Sarah. Finally, she returned with an expression that had grown considerably more serious. "Private Martinez, based on your demonstrated capabilities and your family military history, you're being considered for immediate transfer to a specialized training program. This is not a typical sniper school." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the afternoon heat. "Ma'am?" Morrison's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "What I'm about to tell you is classified. Are you prepared to hear information that will fundamentally change your military service?" Sarah looked around at the crowd of soldiers, at her grandfather's proud face, at Thompson's bewildered expression. She thought about the girl who had walked into the courtyard that morning asking for a rifle, and how different everything felt now. "Yes, ma'am. I'm ready." Morrison nodded to the 2 men in civilian clothes who began walking toward them. The 2 men in civilian clothes approached with the kind of purposeful stride that made seasoned soldiers instinctively straighten their postures. The taller one, with graying temples and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw, spoke first. "General Morrison, we've been monitoring the situation as requested. The demonstration was quite impressive." Morrison nodded. "Agent Williams, Agent Chen, meet Private Sarah Martinez." "Private, these gentlemen represent a joint military intelligence operation that recruits individuals with very specific skill sets." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. This was moving far beyond anything she'd imagined when she made her simple request that morning. The celebrating crowd had been dispersed by Thompson, leaving only the key personnel and her grandfather, who watched the proceedings with growing concern. Agent Williams studied Sarah with the intensity of someone accustomed to evaluating people as potential assets. "Private Martinez, your shooting demonstration was exceptional, but what we're discussing requires capabilities far beyond marksmanship. Are you familiar with the term asymmetric warfare?" Sarah's military education kicked in. "Yes, sir. Unconventional tactics used to overcome advantages in traditional military strength." "Correct. And in asymmetric situations, sometimes the most effective operators are those who don't fit conventional profiles." Agent Chen spoke for the first time, his accent suggesting California origins despite his Asian features. "A small-statured female marksman, for instance, might access targets and complete missions that would be impossible for traditional operators." General Morrison stepped closer to Sarah. "What they're describing is a highly classified program that operates under the designation Black Talon Protocol. It involves deep cover operations in hostile territories, often with minimal support and extreme risk." The weight of what she was hearing began to settle on Sarah like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about proving she could shoot. These people were talking about real missions, real danger, real consequences that extended far beyond military exercises. Her grandfather must have sensed her uncertainty because he stepped forward. "Excuse me, but Sarah is barely 22 years old. She's been in the military for less than 6 months. Agent Williams turned his analytical gaze toward the older man. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez, your granddaughter's age is actually an advantage in certain operational contexts. Young operatives are less likely to be suspected, more adaptable to changing circumstances, and often possess a level of fearlessness that diminishes with experience." "What exactly would she be doing?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the protective tone of a grandfather but the authority of someone who'd served in combat. Morrison exchanged glances with the two agents before responding. "Manny, you know I can't discuss operational details, but I can tell you that Black Talon operators work in small teams or alone, often in environments where conventional military forces can't operate effectively." Sarah found her voice. "What kind of training would be involved?" Agent Chen smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Extensive. Language immersion, cultural adaptation, advanced marksmanship far beyond what you demonstrated today, combat medicine, technology operations, infiltration techniques, and psychological preparation for extended isolation." "How extensive?" Sarah pressed. 2 years minimum," Williams replied, "assuming you survive the selection process. The dropout rate is approximately 85%. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd thought basic training was challenging, but this sounded like something entirely different. Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Sarah, I need you to understand what's being offered here. This isn't a promotion or a normal career advancement. Black Talon operators give up conventional military careers, often for years at a time. They miss family events, relationships suffer, and the psychological toll can be severe." On the other hand, Agent Williams added, "Successful Black Talon operators have prevented terrorist attacks, eliminated high-value targets that threatened national security, and gathered intelligence that saved countless lives. The work matters." Sarah looked around at the faces watching her, her grandfather's expression mixed pride with worry. Thompson seemed completely overwhelmed by how far beyond his authority this conversation had moved. Morrison maintained her professional demeanor, but Sarah detected something that might have been concern in her eyes. "I need to think about this," Sarah said finally. Williams checked his watch. "Unfortunately, this opportunity has a very limited window. If you're selected for the program, you'd leave Fort Campbell tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Black Talon Protocol operates under unique circumstances," Chen explained. "We can't have potential candidates discussing the program with others or having time to develop security concerns. It's all or nothing right now. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Sarah could hear the distant sound of regular training operations continuing across the base. Soldiers going through the normal routines that she'd been part of just hours earlier. That world suddenly seemed very far away. What would happen if I said no? She asked. Morrison answered. You'd continue your regular military service. Your shooting demonstration today was impressive enough that you'd likely be accepted into standard sniper training within a year or two. You'd have a good career. But, Williams added, this opportunity won't come again. Black Talon protocol doesn't recruit from the general military population. We identify candidates through very specific circumstances. Sarah thought about the girl who had demanded a rifle that morning. That person had been willing to risk everything for a chance to prove herself. Now she was being offered something beyond her wildest dreams, but the cost was higher than she'd ever imagined. Her grandfather stepped closer. Mijo, whatever you decide, I'll support. But remember that courage isn't about taking every risk that comes along. Sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to say no. Morrison nodded in agreement. Sarah, your grandfather is right. There's no shame in choosing the conventional path. You've already proven more today than most soldiers prove in entire careers. Agent Williams remained silent, but his expression suggested he was cataloging every word and gesture, building a psychological profile that would influence whatever decision his organization made. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them, her voice was steady. If I agree to this, what's the first step? Chen smiled, and this time it seemed genuine. Transportation leaves at 0600 hours tomorrow morning. You'll be allowed to pack one small bag with personal items. Everything else will be provided. And I can't tell anyone where I'm going. Your family will be informed that you've been selected for classified training. They won't be able to contact you during the initial phases, Williams explained. Sarah looked at her grandfather one more time. In his weathered face, she saw decades of military service. The wisdom that came from having made life-altering decisions under pressure. But she also saw something else, understanding. He knew what she was going to choose before she said the words, I accept. Morrison nodded slowly. Very well. Black Talon protocol is now active for candidate Martinez. The helicopter touched down on a remote landing pad surrounded by dense forest somewhere in the mountains of Colorado. Sarah had been traveling for 6 hours. First by military transport plane and then by this unmarked aircraft with windows too dark to see through. The pilot wore no visible insignia, and her escorts had remained largely silent during the journey. As she stepped onto the tarmac, the thin mountain air hit her lungs like a shock. The facility before her looked nothing like Fort Campbell or any other military installation she'd seen. Low concrete buildings nestled into the mountainside as if they'd grown there naturally. No flags flew overhead, no signs identified the location, and the handful of personnel she could see wore civilian clothing. Agent Williams appeared at her side, having traveled on a separate aircraft that landed moments before hers. Welcome to Training Site 7, though that's not its official designation. You'll find this place doesn't appear on any public maps. A woman approached them from the nearest building. She appeared to be in her mid-30s with the lean build of a distance runner and eyes that suggested she'd seen more of the world than most people twice her age. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore nondescript outdoor clothing that somehow looked expensive. Martinez, I presume, the woman said, extending her hand. I'm Commander Sarah Reeves, though you'll call me Reeves. I run the training program here. Sarah shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and calloused palms. Ma'am, drop the military formalities. Black Talon operators work in environments where military bearing can get them killed. From now on, you'll learn to blend into whatever environment your mission requires. They walked toward the main building, passing other trainees engaged in various activities. Sarah noticed the diversity immediately. Men and women of different ages, ethnicities, and physical builds. Some were running obstacle courses that looked nothing like standard military training, while others practiced what appeared to be ordinary civilian activities like shopping or dining. Your class started 3 weeks ago, Reeves explained as they entered the building. We've accelerated your admission based on General Morrison's recommendation and your demonstrated capabilities. That means you'll be working twice as hard to catch up. The interior of the building was surprisingly comfortable, more like a corporate training facility than a military installation. Classrooms with advanced technology lined one hallway, while another led to what appeared to be living quarters. How many people are in my class? Sarah asked. Started with 24 candidates. We're down to 18. Reeves's matter-of-fact tone suggested this attrition rate was completely normal. They stopped at a door marked only with the number 247. Reeves handed Sarah a keycard. Your room. You'll find appropriate clothing and equipment. Dinner is at 1900 in the main hall, followed by orientation. Questions. Sarah had dozens of questions, but something about Reeves's demeanor suggested this wasn't the time for them. No, ma'am. I mean, no. Good. One piece of advice: everything you think you know about military training, forget it. What we do here is different. Reeves turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Martinez. Your shooting demonstration at Fort Campbell was impressive, but it was also the easy part. The hard part starts tomorrow. Alone in her room, Sarah examined her new environment. The space was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with a single bed, desk, and wardrobe. Inside the wardrobe, she found an assortment of civilian clothing in her exact size, from business attire to casual wear to outdoor gear. A note on the desk simply read, "Wear the blue outfit to dinner." The dining hall buzzed with quiet conversation when Sarah arrived. Her fellow candidates ranged in age from early 20s to what appeared to be mid-40s. She recognized military bearing in some, but others could have been college students or office workers. A man about her own age with sandy hair and an easy smile waved her over to an empty seat. You must be the new arrival. I'm David Kim, formerly Army Rangers. Sarah sat down, grateful for the friendly gesture. Sarah Martinez, formerly trying to figure out what I've gotten myself into. David laughed. That feeling doesn't go away. I've been here 3 weeks and I still wake up wondering if this is all some elaborate psychological experiment. What's the training like? Sarah asked, keeping her voice low. Unlike anything you've experienced, answered a woman across the table. She appeared to be in her 30s with short red hair and the kind of muscle definition that came from years of serious physical training. I'm Jennifer Walsh, former Navy SEAL. The physical stuff here makes SEAL training look like summer camp. It's not just the physical challenges, added an older man with graying hair and intelligent eyes. I'm Dr. Marcus Thompson, former CIA analyst. The psychological components are intense. Sarah was about to ask what he meant when Reeves entered the dining hall. All conversation stopped immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a new candidate joining us. Sarah Martinez demonstrated exceptional marksmanship skills at Fort Campbell and comes highly recommended. She'll be integrated into all current training modules starting tomorrow. Reeves's gaze swept the room. As you all know, we're approaching the first major elimination phase. 3 of you will not advance to the next training level. I suggest you use tonight to prepare mentally for tomorrow's exercises. After Reeves left, the atmosphere in the dining hall grew considerably more tense. Sarah noticed glances between candidates that seemed to mix assessment with suspicion. What kind of elimination? She asked quietly. David's expression had grown serious. They don't tell you beforehand. Could be anything from a combat scenario to a psychological evaluation to a test of technical skills. The only thing we know for sure is that it's designed to identify weaknesses under pressure. Jennifer nodded grimly. And it's always something that tests multiple capabilities simultaneously. They don't eliminate people based on single skill deficiencies. After dinner, Sarah returned to her room to find a thick manual on her desk titled Operational Psychology in Hostile Environments. A note attached read, Complete chapters 1 to 5 by tomorrow morning. Quiz at 0800 hours. As she began reading, Sarah realized the manual covered topics she'd never encountered in any military training. Techniques for maintaining psychological stability during extended isolation, methods for building cover identities that could withstand investigation, strategies for extracting information from unwilling sources without appearing to interrogate them. By midnight, her eyes were burning from reading, but she was only halfway through the assigned material. The complexity of what Black Talon operators were expected to master was staggering. They weren't just elite soldiers. They were expected to be actors, psychologists, linguists, and intelligence analysts all at once. A soft knock at her door interrupted her studying. She opened it to find David holding 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this, he said, offering her one of the cups. First night studying is always brutal. Thanks. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. Can I ask you something? Why did you volunteer for this? David's expression grew thoughtful. My unit was deployed to Afghanistan 3 years ago. We lost good people because we couldn't get intelligence on terrorist cells operating in civilian populations. Traditional military operations just couldn't reach them. He paused, staring into his coffee. I figured if there was a way to prevent that from happening to other units, I had to try. Sarah understood. My grandfather always said that if you have a skill that could help people, you have an obligation to develop it. Smart man. What did he think about you coming here? Sarah thought about their brief goodbye at Fort Campbell, the mixture of pride and worry in her grandfather's eyes. He told me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. David smiled. Sounds like he raised you right. Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow starts what they call Reality Adjustment Week. What's that? The week when they break down everything you think you know about yourself and start rebuilding you into something else. David's smile faded. And Sarah? When it gets really hard, and it will, remember why you're here. As she watched him disappear down the hallway, Sarah returned to her manual with renewed focus. Tomorrow would begin her transformation from the girl who had demanded a rifle into something she couldn't yet imagine. The alarm in Sarah's room screamed at 500 hours, jolting her from the 3 hours of sleep she'd managed between studying and worrying. Outside her window, the mountain peaks were still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, and frost covered the glass like crystalline warnings of what lay ahead. The testing facility was unlike anything Sarah had encountered in her military experience. Instead of a standard classroom, she found herself in what appeared to be an airplane cabin, complete with passenger seats, overhead bins, and the claustrophobic feeling of being 30,000 feet above ground. Reeves stood at the front of the mock cabin, dressed as a flight attendant, her previous military bearing completely transformed into the practiced smile and posture of airline personnel. The other 17 candidates sat scattered throughout the seats, each looking as confused as Sarah felt. Good morning, passengers, Reeves announced in a voice that perfectly mimicked airline professionalism. Welcome aboard Flight 447 nonstop service to Madrid. Our flight time today will be approximately 9 hours. Sarah exchanged glances with David, who sat 2 rows ahead of her. This was clearly some kind of scenario exercise, but its purpose remained unclear. However, Reeves continued, her voice shifting subtly but maintaining the facade, we've received word that there may be a security concern among our passengers today. Some of you are exactly who you appear to be, others are not. The candidates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand the implications of what was happening. Reeves walked down the aisle, distributing sealed envelopes to each candidate. Inside your envelope, you'll find either a passport and boarding pass confirming your identity as an innocent passenger, or you'll find alternate documentation indicating you're an operative with a specific mission. You have 30 seconds to review your materials before we begin. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened her envelope. Inside, she found a passport identifying her as Maria Sanchez, a graduate student in international relations traveling to Madrid for research. Attached was a boarding pass and a detailed background story, complete with family history, university transcripts, and even photos of people identified as her relatives. Looking around the cabin, she could see other candidates reviewing similar materials, their faces betraying nothing about what they'd discovered. The exercise was becoming clear. Some were innocent passengers, some were operatives, and they had to figure out who was who while maintaining their own covers. The scenario begins now, Reeves announced. We'll be conducting routine security interviews with each passenger. Remember, lives may depend on your performance. For the next hour, candidates were called forward one by one to be interviewed by instructors playing the roles of air marshals. Sarah watched carefully as her fellow trainees attempted to maintain their assigned identities under questioning that grew progressively more intense. Jennifer Walsh, the former Navy SEAL, was interviewed as a businesswoman traveling to Spain for a conference. Under pressure, she maintained her cover perfectly, even producing fake business cards and a detailed knowledge of the fictional company she supposedly worked for. David's interview was more challenging. He'd been assigned the role of a suspicious passenger, and the instructors pressed him relentlessly about inconsistencies in his story. Sarah watched him sweat under the questioning, but he never broke character, even when they accused him of lying. When Sarah's turn came, she approached the interview area with her stomach churning. The instructor, a man she'd never seen before, studied her passport with suspicious intensity. Miss Sanchez, what's the purpose of your visit to Madrid? I'm researching medieval Spanish architecture for my master's thesis at Georgetown University, Sarah replied, falling naturally into the cover identity. Her grandfather's stories about his time in Spain during a military exchange program suddenly became useful, as she drew on half-remembered details about Spanish culture and history. And you're funding this research how? Through a combination of university grants and family support. My parents run a restaurant in San Antonio. The lie came easily, built on the foundation of her actual background but twisted into something completely fictional. The questioning continued for 20 minutes, growing more intense as the instructor tried to find cracks in her story. He challenged her knowledge of Spanish architecture, questioned her university records, and even asked detailed questions about her fictional family. Sarah found herself drawing on every aspect of her life experience to maintain the charade. Her grandfather's military stories became family anecdotes about her fictional father's service. Her own knowledge of competitive shooting was transformed into her fictional brother's hobby. Even her memories of growing up in Texas were adjusted to fit the background of Maria Sanchez. Finally, the instructor dismissed her with a nod. "Thank you, Miss Sanchez. Enjoy your flight." As she returned to her seat, Sarah realized she was shaking slightly. The exercise had been more psychologically demanding than any physical challenge she'd faced. Creating and maintaining a false identity under pressure required a type of mental flexibility she'd never developed. The elimination came 2 hours later, after all candidates had been interviewed. Reeves stood at the front of the cabin, back in her military bearing, and called 3 names. Sarah held her breath until she was certain hers wasn't among them. The 3 eliminated candidates left without ceremony or explanation. The remaining 15 sat in silence, processing what they'd experienced. "This exercise tested your ability to think and adapt under pressure," Reeves explained after the eliminated candidates had gone. "In real operations, your cover identity may be the only thing standing between you and death. Creating and maintaining false personas isn't acting, it's survival." Over the following days, the training intensified beyond anything Sarah had imagined. Physical challenges that pushed her body to its limits were combined with psychological exercises that seemed designed to break down her sense of self. She learned to pick locks while carrying on casual conversation. She practiced reading micro-expressions to detect deception while being lied to herself. She memorized the layouts of foreign cities she'd never visited and learned to speak Mandarin Chinese with enough fluency to pass casual inspection. The elimination exercises came randomly and without warning. Candidates would simply disappear, usually overnight, until only 12 remained. The psychological pressure of never knowing when you might be next added another layer of stress to an already demanding environment. Sarah's shooting skills, which had gotten her into the program, became just one tool among many. She learned to assemble and fire weapons she'd never seen before, often in complete darkness or while maintaining a cover identity that wouldn't normally have access to firearms. The breaking point came during week 6, in an exercise the instructors called total immersion. Sarah was given a new identity, Elena Petrov, a Russian art dealer, and placed in a mock European city built within the training facility. Her mission: identify and make contact with 3 other operatives while avoiding detection by hostile surveillance. The challenge seemed straightforward until Sarah realized that the hostile surveillance included some of her fellow candidates who had been given missions to identify and eliminate operatives like her. The exercise wasn't just about maintaining cover. It was about surviving while people she'd trained alongside for weeks actively hunted her. For 72 hours, Sarah lived as Elena Petrov, sleeping in safe houses, meeting contacts in coded conversations, and constantly looking over her shoulder for threats that could come from anyone. She discovered skills she hadn't known she possessed, an intuitive ability to read situations and people that went beyond anything she'd been taught. When the exercise ended, only 10 candidates remained. 2 had been killed by fellow trainees, and another had suffered a psychological breakdown that removed her from the program. That night, alone in her room, Sarah stared at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the person looking back. The girl who had demanded a rifle at Fort Campbell seemed like a stranger from another lifetime. In her place was someone harder, more watchful, capable of becoming anyone the mission required. She thought about her grandfather's words about courage and wondered if he would recognize the person she was becoming. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of abilities she was still discovering. But for the first time since arriving at Training Site 7, she felt confident she would survive whatever came next. The transformation was complete. Sarah Martinez, the ambitious soldier, was gone. In her place was something new, something dangerous, something the world would never see coming until it was too late. 18 months later, Sarah sat in a cafe in Prague reading a newspaper in perfect check while keeping one eye on the man at the corner table who had been following her for 3 days. To anyone watching, she was Katerina Novak, a freelance journalist researching a story about art smuggling in Eastern Europe. In reality, she was 3 days into her first real Black Talon mission. The training at Site 7 had ended 8 months ago, with only 6 candidates graduating. Sarah had emerged as the top performer in the final evaluations, demonstrating an almost supernatural ability to adapt to new identities and situations. The girl who had once been mocked for requesting a rifle had become something the intelligence community had never seen before. Her handler, a woman known only as Control, spoke through an earpiece disguised as a hearing aid. Target confirmed entering the astronomical clock area. You have a 15-minute window. Sarah folded her newspaper and left exact change on the table, moving with the unhurried pace of a tourist with nowhere particular to be. The man who had been following her hesitated for a moment before getting up to pursue. Exactly as she had planned, her real target, Viktor Kozlov, was an arms dealer who had been selling advanced military technology to terrorist organizations across 3 continents. Traditional law enforcement couldn't touch him because he operated through a network of legitimate businesses and diplomatic connections. The Czech government had no idea he was in their country, and he planned to keep it that way. Sarah had spent months becoming Katerina Novak, building a cover identity so detailed that it included social media accounts dating back years, university records, and even former colleagues who would vouch for her if contacted. She'd written articles for obscure publications, attended art gallery openings, and created a digital footprint that would withstand intensive investigation. The real genius of her approach was that Viktor Kozlov had contacted her. Her fabricated articles about art smuggling had attracted his attention. As a potential journalist who might be useful for laundering his reputation, he thought he was manipulating an ambitious reporter. He had no idea he was walking into a trap set by someone who had spent 2 years learning to become anyone she needed to be. As Sarah approached the astronomical clock, she could see Kozlov waiting exactly where intelligence reports had predicted. He was a tall man in his 50s with the kind of expensive casual clothing that screamed money, while trying to appear modest. What the intelligence reports hadn't mentioned was his nervous energy, the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings. Ms. Novak? He approached her with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control of every situation. Mr. Kozlov, thank you for agreeing to meet. Sarah's accent was flawless Czech, practiced until it became as natural as breathing. I'm very interested in your perspective on the art market. As they walked through the crowded square, Sarah let Kozlov guide the conversation, playing the role of an eager journalist collecting quotes for her story. But she was actually doing something far more complex, identifying his security protocols, mapping his communication methods, and gathering intelligence about his organization's structure. The man following her had been joined by 2 others, confirming her assessment that Kozlov traveled with a 3-person security team, professional but not military trained, focused more on protection than detection. They were looking for obvious threats, not for a small Czech journalist who seemed primarily interested in discussing art history. After an hour of seemingly casual conversation, Kozlov suggested they continue their discussion over dinner. This was the moment Sarah had been working toward, the invitation that would give her access to his private security arrangements and communication systems. The restaurant was expensive and discreet, the kind of place where wealthy criminals felt comfortable conducting business. Kozlov had reserved a private dining room, which meant his security team would be positioned outside while he felt safe inside. During dinner, Sarah played her role perfectly, asking the kinds of questions a journalist would ask while mentally cataloging every detail about Kozlov's operation. She learned about his travel schedule, his business relationships, and most importantly, the location of a meeting planned for the following week where he would transfer stolen missile guidance systems to a known terrorist organization. "You know," Kozlov said as dessert arrived, "I think we could help each other beyond this simple interview. I have connections in the art world that could benefit an ambitious journalist." Sarah smiled with exactly the right mixture of interest and caution. "I'd certainly be open to hearing about legitimate opportunities." Legitimate is such a relative term, don't you think? Kozlov's smile carried implications that would have terrified the real Katerina Novak. But Sarah Martinez had spent 2 years learning to hide her reactions behind whatever face the situation required. "I suppose that depends on one's perspective," she replied carefully. The conversation continued for another hour, with Kozlov gradually revealing more about his operation, while believing he was recruiting a useful asset. By the time they parted company, Sarah had everything she needed to prevent the weapons transfer and dismantle a significant portion of Kozlov's network. Back in her hotel room, Sarah transmitted her intelligence through encrypted channels to a team that would ensure Viktor Kozlov's arms-dealing days were over. Local authorities would arrest him within 48 hours on charges that would hold up in court, while his terrorist contacts would find their meeting location surrounded by international security forces. As she prepared to leave Prague and assume her next identity, Sarah thought about the girl who had stood in that Fort Campbell courtyard demanding a chance to prove herself. That person had wanted to be a soldier, to serve her country in a traditional, honorable way. What she had become was something different, something that couldn't be acknowledged or celebrated. There would be no medals for preventing a terrorist attack, no recognition for dismantling an arms-dealing network, no official record that Sarah Martinez had ever been in Prague. But somewhere in the world, people were alive because weapons hadn't reached those who would use them to kill innocent civilians. Somewhere, families were safe because a young woman who had once been mocked for her ambition had become exactly the kind of operative her country needed. Her phone buzzed with a new message from Control. "Next assignment briefing in 72 hours. New identity package being prepared." Sarah smiled as she began packing her few belongings. The girl who had demanded a rifle had gotten so much more than she'd ever imagined. She'd become the rifle, precise and deadly, aimed at targets that threatened everything she'd sworn to protect. In the morning, Katerina Novak would disappear forever, and Sarah Martinez would become someone new. Someone else who didn't exist in any official record, but who would make the world a little safer simply by being exactly who the mission required her to be. The mockery that had greeted her request at Fort Campbell seemed like something from another lifetime. Those who had laughed at a small woman asking for a weapon they didn't think she could handle would never know that she'd become something far more dangerous than any rifle. A person who could be anyone, go anywhere, and accomplish missions that traditional military forces couldn't even attempt. General Morrison's words echoed in her memory. Black Talon Protocol. The name finally made sense. Like the talon of a hunting bird, she struck swiftly and precisely, then disappeared without leaving a trace. Standing at her hotel window, looking out at the beautiful city of Prague, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She'd found her place in the world, even if that place officially didn't exist. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new identities, new missions that would test everything she'd learned. But tonight, she was exactly who she'd always been meant to be. A weapon in the hands of those who protected the innocent, invisible and unstoppable, shaped by mockery into something extraordinary.